there's been mixed fortunes in both cup competitions. For me, one of the best performances of the Slot era so far against Tottenham, unbelievably dominant against a top quality team, admittedly one not performing very well this season, but still one with so many threats in their team, followed up by the low point, surely, of Slot's era so far, maybe the worst performance, certainly the worst result, losing to Plymouth and getting knocked out of the FA Cup. I mean, yeah, would you agree that's surely the low point of the Slot era so far?
Yeah, I would say so in terms of just the pure results. And I don't care how many changes you make, you kind of would expect better from a Liverpool squad of any sort, even with a few youngsters involved, because there was a lot of senior internationals on the pitch. And that's the side that's bottom of the Championship, worst defensive record. And Liverpool, of course, are top of the Premier League. So it's a big, or should have been a big gulf between the sides. And it's interesting, really, because I think Slot, after the game, kind of accepted that, okay, the team and the squad I selected there, I took a risk. He accepted what the risk was, and he knew what the reasons behind taking that risk were. And when you do that, these kind of things can happen. So he seemed quite accepting of it. But then we saw him in the press conference this morning, and he described the results and the performance as unacceptable. So I guess he kind of watched it back and realised quite how bad it was. So he didn't seem as kind of accepting of it today as he maybe was at the time. So it was it was a poor result, but most crucially, and this is the thing that Slot was focused on, was a poor performance, really. So I think that's what disappointed him the most, albeit there are maybe some upsides to this defeat, to be honest.
Yeah, I want to touch on that a bit more because, I mean, we'll get to the upsides, to the perceived upsides. Certainly, Slot doesn't think there are any. I think the quote in the press conference was, "Nothing good can come of losing a game of football." But the performance, yeah, I mean, the result, it stands out. It's an awful result, and one of the big FA Cup upsets in recent years for a team struggling so badly to beat a team that has been flying all season. But the performance, when you consider, yes, there were a lot of changes, but also a lot of those players fighting for their first team place, trying to get more regular first team football. Chiesa stands out and has probably been the lightning rod for the criticism, and it was a really poor performance from him. But, you know, he was by no means on his own there, putting out a bad performance in that result. And that was, yeah, the really disappointing thing, is the defeat you can sort of get a few pluses out of looking ahead for the rest of the season if you're a Liverpool fan looking for positives from that. But the performance was just so uncharacteristic from what we've seen from them this season.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably easier to pick out the ones who played well, really. I mean, I think he's limited to maybe, I thought Endo was okay and battled in there. I think Liverpool would have been a lot better, by the way, had he stayed in midfield. They missed some steel in there, and that kind of set the tone for the game for me, really. So I thought Endo was okay. Quanta didn't do too badly, but then outside of that, as you say, pretty much the rest of the team really struggled, didn't he? And it's so unusual for Liverpool, because even after kind of the PSV defeat recently, we were talking about, it was still a decent performance in parts, and to go away to the Dutch champions and play that well with a really heavily changed team was extremely impressive. We didn't really see anything of the sort here. I think it was just crazy how much kind of, and I'm not using this as an excuse at all, it's a criticism, really. Is clearly the pitch wasn't Premier League level, and there was a few bobbles in it, but the fact that they couldn't get to grips with this over 90 minutes, the quality of football that Liverpool had on the pitch, I found that's pretty stunning, really. And they just couldn't get the game going. And I do wonder whether that, if I'm looking for some mitigation, that Endo change, moving him back because of Gomez's injury, that really hurt Liverpool in terms of progressing the ball. Because they ended up then with a midfield of McConnell, Naoni, and Elliott, which is very, very lightweight in a game where physicality was the order of the day, and therefore they couldn't progress the ball. And so then when Chiesa's getting it, he's about 35 yards from goal with 3 players to take on. And, it was the same for basically all of the attackers. Where they were getting the ball, they weren't getting it in good areas where they could impact it. So that maybe was kind of the cause for their poor performance. But I still think you would expect more from the senior players there. How can they help out the young lads in midfield, make their job easier? Can they get the ball forward better? Can they play a part in that? I think you would have liked more from them. But the idea that they were kind of starved of really good service, I think, is probably best underlined by the fact that Jota has one shot in the game, and that is the one right near the end. So, a mixture of issues there, really. But I would still stick to the feeling, and I think Arne Slot felt like this after watching it back, that the senior players could have offered a little bit more, and that's probably the main disappointment, really.
It almost feels to me like it was such a bad performance and so out of keeping with the rest of the season that hopefully it won't have too destabilizing an impact, because it's just completely different Liverpool from what we've seen all season. And in a way, that's easier to write off as just a one-off, one of those days. Liverpool just didn't perform well on that day, rather than a sign of deeper issues which might affect them going forward. Maybe I'm looking very much at the positive side of it and how it won't affect Liverpool going forward, but it felt like that bad a result and that bad a performance that, in a way, it makes me a little less worried that it's something that's going to drag on into future games.
Yeah, that's it. So incredibly out of character for this team, really, this season. And I think you've just got to look at it as well in terms of how repeatable is that? How likely are we to see that performance again? And the reality is probably not very. We're not going to see that lineup again, which is bad news for the fringe players who are involved, by the way, because it's looking at where they're going to get their minutes now, and it's very, very hard to see where they get significant minutes. How much will we see of Harvey Elliott? How much will we see of Chiesa over the rest of the season? Quanta similarly. It's really, really difficult to see where they get any involvement. But on the basis of a lot of these performances that you saw in that game, you'd say they probably don't deserve an awful lot either. So, I think it's going to. I don't think we will see that performance again. And I'm also pretty sure as well that, when you do change things and you lean on your squad in the remaining games, it's going to be one or two changes, isn't it? It's going to be Harvey Elliott coming into a team where he's got McAllister and Gravenberch behind him. It's going to be Chiesa coming on in the last 30 minutes for Mo Salah, maybe to give him a rest. And I'm sure you'll probably see better performances from those players when they're given that kind of environment to thrive in. So that'll be the hope anyway. So I don't think it's anything that Liverpool will take too much from. But the real downside, as I say, and the real kind of issue I think for a lot of the players that were involved was that it's very, very hard to see how much time on the pitch they're going to get now without those FA Cup games coming up.
Yeah, so bad news for them. But in terms of Liverpool as a club and as a team for their goals this season, I mean, I think just getting through to the League Cup final was when the quadruple word started to be uttered a bit more, and then immediately next game it's off the table. Is this a blessing in disguise, as some fans have tried to paint it, or are you more of the slot thinking that you want to be in every competition, you want to be fighting to the end? Or does this, in effect, give Liverpool a better chance of going on, getting over the line in the Premier League, Champions League, and obviously League Cup? They've just got that one game left.
Yeah, well, as a starting point, I mean, anything around the quadruple, I just find ridiculous to even talk about, to be honest. It's such a pipe dream, so difficult to do. And there's a reason nobody's done it, because it's, borderline impossible. You need so many things to go your way. And, you start relying more on kind of luck in games and luck in terms of fitness of your squad as well, because you're absolutely battering it over the remainder of the season. So I think that is where you take real upside, because as much as Arne Slot will say he's disappointed to go out, he must be looking at that kind of free weekend it opens up, and the fact that every midweek's now not going to be clogged if you keep going in the competition. The fact that it would have been City away next, by the way, kind of takes the edge off it as well, because that would have been another game where you would have felt you have to go full strength for, because City definitely will, because it's probably one of their best opportunities to get a trophy on board now over the remainder of this season. So I just think it's hard not to see the upsides. And I think that's not dismissing the FA Cup, by the way, because if Liverpool hadn't gone as far as they have in the League Cup, I think you could have poured a little bit more into the FA Cup. But once that happens, once you're through in the Champions League, once you're in this unbelievable position in the Premier League, and you've only won it once in the last 30 odd years, you really do need to kind of think about what your priorities are. And I think Arne Slot's selection, not just the team itself, but the squad he named going down there, said everything about where it is on Liverpool's priority list. And I think, he put on a bit of a front in terms of saying it was unacceptable, and he probably wasn't happy with the performance. But the reality of it is, surely he will see that there are these big upsides and positives to come from it, because it's not that difficult now to see Liverpool, being able to pour everything into a League Cup final and then have that nice balance then of the Champions League and Premier League over the remainder of the season and getting over the line, because you're then not putting strain on your squad as well. Because best example possible really is Joe Gomez limping off in this FA Cup game that Liverpool weren't that fussed about. They're now a little bit short at centre half. That won't happen again now this season. If they lose someone, it will be in a Premier League or Champions League game or the League Cup final, games that really, really matter. So that's kind of the important thing to take from it, from my perspective anyway.
Yeah, that's the thing. no one's saying the FA Cup was the lowest priority at the start of the season, but the way the season's transpired, getting to that League Cup final, it did become the lowest priority. I mean, do you think if we're dealing in hypotheticals, there's probably no point talking about this, but do you think if Liverpool hadn't gone through against Tottenham, hadn't gone through in that semi-final second leg, they would have treated that game with a bit more importance?
I think this specific game, possibly not, just because regardless of whether you went through against Tottenham, the minutes in the legs would have been there, and that strain would have already been put on the squad. So I think this specific game, he probably still would have gone down a similar route, albeit maybe it would have convinced him to put a bit more strength on the bench, just to say, okay, I actually probably could do with getting through this game. But I think the selection would have been similar. But as you say, in the end, Liverpool got through quite comfortably in that League Cup and secured that first domestic cup final, didn't he? So it really did bring into focus where this game stood in terms of priorities, particularly as Liverpool now have got a run of 5 games in 15 days coming up in the Premier League, and a run that I think could be really decisive.